Hello and welcome to Night Historian. Tonight we examine a story that begins not with conquest or revolution, but with something far more ordinary. A small black seed. This seed would reshape continents, topple empires, and set in motion the events that created the modern world. Before we proceed, I ask only this. Take a moment to like and subscribe. It sustains this work, and I read every comment you leave. If you are willing to share, tell me where in the world you listen and at what hour. Now dim the lights, let the outside world fade away. Picture a marketplace in medieval Venice, sometime in the 14th century. The harbour stretches before the city, crowded with vessels that have travelled impossible distances. Merchants move between stalls, their fingers stained with the residue of countless transactions. Salt and tar mix in the air with something sharper. The scent of pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These are not merely goods, they are the threads connecting distant continents, the reason men risk their lives on treacherous voyages, the foundation upon which fortunes rest. A single pound of pepper costs as much as a sheep. In some years, in some markets, it costs more than gold by weight. This fact alone should arrest your attention. Not because spices are inherently remarkable, but because their value reveals something profound about the medieval world. The people who lived in this era did not understand themselves as historical figures. They knew only the immediate realities before them, the practical necessity of preserving food through winter, the medicinal properties attributed to distant spices, the status that ownership conveyed. The competition to control this trade would reshape everything. The medieval European faced a problem that shaped every aspect of survival. Food did not last. Winter arrived with brutal certainty each year, and the stores accumulated during harvest months deteriorated steadily. Meat rotted within weeks, despite efforts at preservation. Fish turned rank in storage. Grains attracted vermin. The fundamental challenge of keeping a population fed through the cold months drove decisions about trade, warfare, and exploration in ways that few modern people fully comprehend. Salt offered one solution, but it was limited in supply and could only do so much. A salted ham remained recognizably spoiled after months of storage. The taste became unbearable. Digestive illness followed consumption of truly aged meat. Communities that survived on preserved food suffered from malnutrition and disease. The body required more than mere calories. It required nutrients that rotting meat could not provide. Spices addressed this crisis in multiple ways simultaneously. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg possessed antimicrobial properties that genuinely slowed decay. A small amount of pepper added to stored meat extended its edible lifespan by weeks or months. The volatile oils in these spices inhibited the growth of organisms that caused putrefaction. This was not superstition or placebo. The preservation worked, though the mechanism remained unknown to medieval people. They understood only that spices kept food from becoming inedible. Beyond preservation, spices masked the taste of food that had begun to deteriorate. A heavily spiced dish could render partially spoiled meat palatable. This practical benefit cannot be overstated. The ability to consume stored food that would otherwise be discarded meant the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation during harsh winters. Communities with access to spices survived better than those without. Over generations, this survival advantage compounded. Spices also held medicinal properties, or at least were believed to possess them. Medieval medicine operated on theories of humours and balance. Pepper was thought to warm the body and aid digestion. Cloves supposedly relieved tooth pain. Cinnamon was prescribed for fevers. Whether these remedies actually worked remains debatable among historians, but the belief drove demand. A person suffering from a digestive distress would seek pepper. A family facing plague would purchase whatever spices they could afford, hoping for protection. The psychological benefit of believing in treatment cannot be dismissed. Hope itself provides some comfort when facing disease. The medicinal association created a secondary market among the wealthy and educated. Physicians prescribed spices. Apothecaries stocked them. Monasteries centers of learning and healing, maintained supplies for their infirmaries. The church itself used spices in religious ceremonies and incense. This institutional demand created steady markets independent of food preservation needs. Status and display formed perhaps the most powerful driver of spice demand. A merchant or nobleman who could afford pepper demonstrated wealth and connections to distant lands. Spices appeared on the tables of the powerful. Feasts featured heavily spiced dishes. The ability to serve pepper-laden food signaled access to luxury, to international trade networks, to power itself. Possession of spices became a form of currency in social hierarchies. A lord who served spiced wine and spiced meat elevated his status among peers. A merchant who could afford saffron or cloves announced his success to the community. This status function created demand that transcended practical necessity. Once spices became associated with wealth and refinement, people of means competed to display them. The competition drove prices higher. Higher prices increased prestige. The cycle reinforced itself. A pound of pepper represented not merely food preservation or medicine, but visible proof of a person's position in the social order. The psychological dimension of spices operated at another level as well. These were products of distant lands, places most Europeans would never see. Pepper came from the Malabar coast of India, a region so remote that it seemed almost mythical. Cinnamon originated in Ceylon, a name that conjured images of exotic abundance. Cloves grew in the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, islands so distant that their exact location remained uncertain in European minds. To possess these spices was to possess a tangible connection to the wider world. The scent of pepper carried within it the promise of distant shores, of knowledge beyond the local, of connection to something greater than one's immediate community. Medieval Europe was not isolated, but it was limited in its direct access to distant regions. Trade occurred primarily through intermediaries. A merchant in Venice might never travel to India, yet pepper from India would arrive in his warehouse. This indirect connection created fascination. The spice became a symbol of the possible, of what lay beyond the horizon. In a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, spices represented the exotic and the unreachable. The hunger for spices, therefore, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It was practical. Food preservation genuinely required spices. It was medical. People believed spices could cure illness. It was social. Displaying spices demonstrated status. It was psychological. Spices represented connection to the wider world. This convergence of practical, medical, social, and psychological factors created demand that was nearly insatiable among those who could afford it. By the 13th and 14th centuries, spice demand in Europe had grown substantially. Wealthy households maintained supplies. Merchants built fortunes on spice trade. Cities competed for access to spice markets. The hunger had become systemic, embedded in the economic and social structures of medieval civilization. This hunger would drive exploration, warfare, and the reshaping of global trade networks for centuries to come. The irony, which historians continue to debate, is that much of the medicinal benefit attributed to spices was likely psychological. The preservation properties were real, but the curative powers were largely imaginary. Yet this distinction mattered little. Belief drove behavior. Behavior drove economics. Economics drove history. The hunger for spices was real, regardless of whether the spices truly cured plague or merely made people believe they might survive it. Black pepper grows in only a handful of regions on Earth. The Malabar coast of Kerala, in southwestern India, produced the majority of the world's supply during the medieval period. Certain areas of Southeast Asia, particularly what is now Vietnam and Indonesia, contributed smaller quantities. This geographic concentration meant that pepper was not merely rare, but fundamentally constrained by the limits of where it could be cultivated. Unlike wheat or barley, which could grow across much of Europe and Asia, pepper required specific conditions: tropical climate, particular soil composition, adequate rainfall, and precise seasonal patterns. The plant could not be transplanted to Europe or the Middle East and made to flourish. The supply was fixed by geography. The peppercorn itself is the dried fruit of the Piper nigrum vine. The plant produces small green berries that ripen to red. Harvesters pick these berries and dry them in the sun for several weeks, during which they shrivel and turn black. The result is the hard, wrinkled seed that medieval merchants prized. Within this small object lies concentrated flavour, volatile oils that create the characteristic heat and pungency. A single peppercorn contains enough flavour to season a substantial portion of food. This concentration of flavour in a lightweight, durable package made pepper ideal for long-distance trade. Unlike fresh spices that would spoil during months of transport, dried pepper remained stable. Unlike bulky goods that required enormous cargo space, pepper occupied minimal volume while commanding high value. The production process, however, imposed severe constraints on supply. A pepper vine requires 3 to 4 years of growth before it produces fruit. A farmer could not respond to increased demand by simply planting more vines and harvesting within a season. The lag between planting and production meant that supply could not quickly adjust to market pressures. If demand spiked, prices would rise, but farmers could not increase output for years. This lag created structural scarcity. The market could not reach equilibrium through normal supply and demand mechanisms because supply could not adjust rapidly. Furthermore, pepper production remained vulnerable to environmental factors beyond human control. A poor monsoon season reduced yields. Disease could devastate entire plantations. Flooding or drought destroyed crops. A single bad harvest could reduce supply by 20 or 30%, sending prices soaring across Europe. Farmers had no way to protect themselves against these risks. They could not store unharvested peppercorns. They could not shift production to alternative crops quickly. They were locked into pepper cultivation by geography and climate. The combination of geographic limitation, slow production cycles, environmental vulnerability, and concentrated flavour created a commodity unlike most others. Pepper was genuinely scarce in a way that most goods were not. The scarcity was not artificial or temporary. It was structural, built into the nature of pepper cultivation itself. This fundamental scarcity would drive everything that followed. The value of pepper in medieval markets reflected this scarcity with brutal clarity. A pound of pepper in Venice during the 14th century could cost between 1 and 2 gold florins. A skilled labourer earned perhaps 1 florin per month. A pound of pepper therefore represented a month's wages for an ordinary worker. For comparison, a pound of gold cost roughly the same amount. Pepper and gold occupied similar price ranges. In some markets, in some years, pepper exceeded gold by weight. Historians continue to debate the exact ratios, but the evidence is unambiguous. Pepper was extraordinarily expensive. This price point reflected not merely the cost of production, but the accumulated markups applied by every intermediary between the farmer and the final consumer. The farmer in Kerala received a fraction of the final price. Local merchants purchased pepper from farmers and transported it to ports, adding their margin. Arab traders bought pepper in Indian ports and carried it across the Indian Ocean, adding their margin. Merchants in the Red Sea or Persian Gulf purchased the pepper and transported it further, adding their margin. Venetian merchants bought pepper in Middle Eastern ports and transported it to Europe, adding their margin. By the time pepper reached a European consumer, it had passed through 5 or 6 sets of hands, each taking profit. The economics of this supply chain created extraordinary incentives for those who controlled key points. A merchant who could monopolize trade at a particular port could charge whatever the market would bear. A city that controlled multiple ports could extract enormous wealth. A state that could protect merchant ships and guarantee safe passage could demand fees and taxes. The scarcity of pepper meant that even small improvements in control or efficiency could generate massive profits. The peppercorn itself became a form of currency in some contexts. Merchants stored pepper as wealth, knowing its value would not diminish. Some records indicate that pepper was accepted as payment for taxes or debts. The spice functioned as a commodity currency, a good whose value was widely recognized and relatively stable. This currency function further increased demand beyond what food preservation or medicine alone would justify. Wealthy individuals accumulated pepper not merely for consumption, but as a store of value. The threads connecting pepper-growing regions to European markets were not single routes, but complex networks. Multiple pathways existed, each controlled by different merchants and states. Some pepper travelled overland through Central Asia, along routes collectively known as the Silk Road. Other pepper travelled by sea through the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Mediterranean. Still other pepper moved through the Persian Gulf and overland through Mesopotamia. The existence of multiple routes meant that no single power could completely monopolize trade, but it also meant that competition for control of key choke points was intense. The pepper trade created wealth not merely for merchants, but for entire cities and states. Ports that handled pepper became centers of commerce and power. Cities that could protect pepper merchants attracted trade. States that could tax pepper transactions accumulated resources. The hunger for pepper in Europe, combined with the scarcity of pepper in production regions, created a vast economic engine. This engine would drive exploration, warfare, and political transformation for centuries. Two primary pathways carried pepper from its sources to European markets, each with distinct characteristics, risks, and economic implications. The overland route, collectively termed the Silk Road, though it was never a single unified path, stretched across Central Asia from China through the territories of various kingdoms and empires. Merchants would load pepper and other goods onto camels or horses at ports in India or Southeast Asia, then begin the arduous journey westward. The route passed through mountain ranges, deserts, and regions controlled by different political powers. A caravan might travel for 18 months or 2 years, stopping at caravanserais, fortified trading posts, to rest animals, trade goods, and gather information about conditions ahead. The maritime route offered an alternative that gradually became dominant during the medieval period. Merchants loaded pepper onto ships in Indian ports, then sailed westward across the Indian Ocean. The journey depended critically on understanding monsoon wind patterns. Ships could not sail directly against these winds. Instead, merchants timed voyages to coincide with favourable wind seasons. A ship might sail from the Malabar coast to the Red Sea in 6 to 8 months, depending on stops and weather. From the Red Sea, pepper could be transported overland to Mediterranean ports or loaded onto other ships for further travel. The maritime route was faster than the overland journey, but required different skills and involved different risks. The choice between routes involved complex calculations. The overland route avoided the dangers of ocean travel, shipwrecks, pirates, storms, but required traversing territories where bandits attacked caravans and local rulers demanded tolls. The maritime route moved goods faster, but exposed merchants to the unpredictability of the sea. A single storm could destroy an entire shipment. Pirates operated in certain waters, particularly around the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Yet the speed advantage of maritime routes meant that merchants could complete multiple voyages in the time required for a single overland journey. The economics gradually favoured maritime trade. Both routes involved multiple intermediaries. A merchant in Venice did not personally travel to India to purchase pepper. Instead, Venetian merchants maintained relationships with Arab traders who controlled ports in Egypt or the Levant. These Arab merchants purchased pepper from Indian merchants or directly from producers. The Indian merchants themselves had purchased pepper from local traders in Kerala or other production regions. Each transaction involved negotiation, risk assessment, and profit calculation. The pepper changed hands multiple times before reaching Europe. The intermediaries were not merely passive conduits. They possessed crucial knowledge about market conditions, prices, quality, and reliability of suppliers. An Arab merchant who understood which Indian suppliers consistently delivered high-quality pepper could command premium prices. A Venetian merchant who maintained exclusive relationships with particular Arab traders could secure favorable terms. The value of these relationships transcended the individual transactions. A merchant who broke faith with suppliers or customers would find future business difficult. Trust, though difficult to quantify, formed the foundation of long-distance trade. The physical infrastructure supporting these routes consisted of ports, caravanserais, warehouses, and fortifications. A major port required facilities for loading and unloading ships, storage for goods awaiting transport or sale, quarters for merchants, and security against theft or piracy. The largest ports, Alexandria in Egypt, Aden in Yemen, Calicut in India, developed into substantial cities. They attracted merchants from multiple regions, creating cosmopolitan communities where different languages, religions, and commercial practices intersected. These ports became centers of information exchange, where merchants learned about conditions in distant markets. Caravanserais served similar functions for overland routes. These fortified compounds provided shelter, water, and security for merchants and their animals. They functioned as trading posts where merchants from different regions could exchange goods. A caravanserai might host merchants traveling in opposite directions. One group heading east with European goods, another heading west with Asian spices. The caravanserai owner profited from fees charged for shelter and services. The merchants benefited from the security and the opportunity to trade with merchants heading in different directions. The timing of voyages and caravans created seasonal patterns in pepper availability and pricing. Pepper arriving in Europe in spring commanded different prices than pepper arriving in autumn. Merchants who could time their purchases and sales to take advantage of seasonal price variations accumulated significant profits. This required knowledge of distant markets and the ability to store pepper for months while awaiting optimal selling conditions. Wealthy merchants with capital reserves could exploit these opportunities, poorer merchants could not. The routes themselves were not stable or unchanging. Political upheaval could render a previously safe route dangerous. A new ruler might impose prohibitive taxes, forcing merchants to seek alternatives. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century disrupted traditional routes through the Middle East, creating urgency among European powers to find alternatives. Conversely, the establishment of stable political authority could open previously dangerous routes. When a powerful state controlled a region, merchants could travel with greater security, which encouraged trade. The routes carried more than pepper. Merchants transported silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, gems from India, and various goods from the Middle East. The same ships and caravans that carried pepper also carried other commodities. This diversification reduced risk for individual merchants. If pepper prices collapsed, a merchant who also carried silk or gems could still profit. The interconnection of different trade goods meant that disruption to one commodity affected the entire system. The knowledge required to navigate these routes was specialized and valuable. Merchants needed to understand wind patterns, seasonal weather, political conditions in various regions, the reliability of different suppliers, and the preferences of different markets. A merchant who understood that European demand for pepper peaked in winter could purchase pepper in summer when prices were lower, store it, and sell it in winter when prices rose. This required capital, storage facilities, and market knowledge. The barriers to entry were substantial, which meant that successful merchants accumulated significant wealth and influence. The routes themselves became objects of political competition. States sought to control key ports and passages. Venice invested enormous resources in maintaining naval superiority in the Mediterranean and maintaining trading posts in the Levant. Genoa competed for similar advantages. The Ottoman Empire, once established, sought to control the straits and passages through which trade flowed. This political competition would eventually drive European exploration, the search for routes that bypassed the territories controlled by rivals. For centuries, Arab and Islamic merchants controlled the flow of pepper from production regions to European markets. This dominance rested on several foundations. Islamic traders understood the routes through the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, with intimate knowledge accumulated over generations. They maintained networks of merchants, agents, and family connections stretching from the coasts of East Africa through India to Southeast Asia. They possessed capital reserves sufficient to purchase large quantities of pepper and finance long voyages. They understood the languages, customs, and business practices of diverse regions. Most importantly, they occupied the geographic positions that made them natural intermediaries. The Islamic world stretched from Spain through North Africa, the Middle East, and into Central Asia. Within this vast territory, Muslim merchants operated with relative freedom, conducting business according to Islamic law and custom. They could travel between Islamic ports without the restrictions that Christian merchants faced. They could establish trading posts and warehouses in Islamic cities. They could borrow money from Islamic bankers using mechanisms that Islamic law permitted. This structural advantage meant that Islamic merchants could operate more efficiently than Christian competitors. The rise of Venice disrupted this Islamic monopoly, though it did not eliminate it. By the 11th century, Venice had begun establishing trading posts in the Levant, the coastal regions of the eastern Mediterranean, controlled by Islamic states. Venetian merchants negotiated treaties with Islamic rulers, securing the right to maintain warehouses and conduct trade in exchange for taxes and fees. Venice developed naval power sufficient to protect merchant ships and enforce trading privileges. The Venetian state backed its merchants with military force, guaranteeing safe passage and punishing pirates or rival traders who interfered with Venetian commerce. This state backing distinguished Venice from earlier merchant networks. Individual Islamic merchants operated within the framework of Islamic law and custom, but they did not have the backing of a unified military power in the way that Venice did. The Venetian Republic was simultaneously a merchant enterprise and a military power. Its galleys protected Venetian traders. Its diplomats negotiated treaties. Its government imposed regulations on trade and collected taxes. This combination of commercial and military power gave Venice advantages that individual merchants, however wealthy, could not match. Genoa emerged as Venice's primary rival. Like Venice, Genoa was a maritime city-state with naval power and merchant networks. Genoese traders established competing posts in the Levant and competed for access to pepper supplies. The competition between Venice and Genoa was not merely commercial, but political and military. The two cities fought naval wars, blockaded each other's ports, and sought to undermine each other's trading relationships. This rivalry would persist for centuries, shaping Mediterranean politics and economics. The Islamic merchants, despite losing their monopoly, remained crucial intermediaries. They controlled ports in Egypt, the Levant, and the Red Sea. They maintained relationships with Indian merchants and suppliers. They understood local political conditions and could navigate the complex web of taxes, tolls, and regulations that different rulers imposed. A Venetian merchant seeking to purchase pepper could not simply sail to India and buy directly from producers. Instead, the Venetian merchant negotiated with Islamic merchants who controlled access to pepper supplies. The Islamic merchants charged fees and markups for their services. The port of Alexandria in Egypt became a crucial choke point in this system. Pepper travelling by sea from India to Europe typically passed through Alexandria. The Mamluk rulers of Egypt controlled this port and extracted substantial taxes on all goods passing through. Venetian merchants maintained a warehouse in Alexandria where they stored pepper and negotiated with Islamic suppliers. The Mamluk government regulated the trade carefully, ensuring that revenues flowed to the state and that no single merchant or group accumulated excessive power. This regulation sometimes benefited Venice, by preventing competitors from gaining advantages, and sometimes harmed Venice by imposing restrictions on Venetian merchants. The gatekeeping function extended beyond merely controlling ports. The Islamic merchants who controlled supplies could manipulate prices by restricting the flow of pepper to market. If a merchant or group of merchants accumulated large quantities of pepper, they could withhold supplies from the market, driving prices higher, then release supplies when prices peaked. This manipulation required capital reserves sufficient to purchase large quantities and storage facilities to hold pepper without it deteriorating. Only wealthy merchants could engage in this practice. The manipulation created opportunities for profit, but also created risks. If prices fell unexpectedly, a merchant holding large stocks could suffer substantial losses. Venice attempted to counter Islamic gatekeeping by establishing direct relationships with suppliers. Venetian merchants travelled to India and Southeast Asia, seeking to purchase pepper directly from producers or local merchants. These ventures were dangerous and expensive, requiring ships capable of long ocean voyages and merchants willing to spend months or years away from home. The returns could be substantial, if successful, but the risks were equally substantial. A ship could sink, merchants could be robbed or killed, political upheaval could prevent trade. Most Venetian merchants preferred to work through established networks in the Levant rather than risk direct voyages to distant regions. The gatekeeping system created layers of profit extraction. A farmer in Kerala might sell pepper to a local merchant for 1 unit of value. The local merchant sold to a regional trader for 2 units. The regional trader sold to an Arab merchant for 3 units. The Arab merchant sold to a Venetian merchant for 5 units. The Venetian merchant sold to a European consumer for 8 units. Each intermediary doubled or tripled the value, extracting profit from the scarcity and the difficulty of transport. By the time pepper reached a European consumer, the price reflected not merely the cost of production, but the accumulated markups of multiple intermediaries. This system created incentives for merchants to control as many steps as possible. A merchant who could eliminate intermediaries could capture their profits. Venice pursued this strategy by establishing direct relationships with suppliers and attempting to reduce reliance on Islamic intermediaries. Islamic merchants pursued the opposite strategy by strengthening their control over key ports and routes, making it difficult for others to bypass them. Genoa competed with Venice for access to the same routes and suppliers. The gatekeeping system was not stable or permanent. Changes in political power, technological innovation, or merchant initiative could disrupt established patterns. A new route could open, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. A powerful merchant could establish new trading posts. A state could impose new regulations or change existing ones. The system persisted because it benefited those who controlled the gates, but it remained vulnerable to disruption. This vulnerability would eventually drive European exploration and the search for alternative routes that would bypass the gatekeepers entirely. The economics of pepper trade rested fundamentally on scarcity creating value. In 14th century Venice, a pound of pepper cost approximately 1 to 2 gold florins. A skilled labourer, a mason, carpenter, or craftsman, earned roughly 1 florin per month. This meant that a pound of pepper represented a month's wages for someone with a valuable trade. An unskilled labourer earned perhaps half a florin monthly, making pepper completely inaccessible. A pound of gold cost roughly the same amount as a pound of pepper, placing these two commodities in direct economic competition. In some years and markets, pepper exceeded gold in price per unit weight. The comparison to gold reveals the extraordinary nature of pepper's value. Gold was universally recognized as precious, durable, and useful for jewelry and decoration. Pepper was a consumable commodity that would be eaten and disappear. Yet medieval markets valued pepper at parity with gold. This valuation reflected not the intrinsic properties of pepper, but the convergence of scarcity, demand, and the structure of supply chains. The markup at each stage of the supply chain created the escalating prices. A farmer in Kerala might sell pepper to a local merchant for a price that represented fair compensation for labour and risk. The local merchant transported pepper to a regional port and sold it to a larger trader, adding a markup of 50 to 100%. The regional trader sold to an Arab merchant, adding another markup. The Arab merchant sold to a Venetian merchant, adding yet another markup. By the time pepper reached Venice, it had passed through 4 or 5 sets of hands, each taking profit. Historians continue to debate the exact markup percentages at each stage, but the evidence suggests that total markups from producer to consumer ranged from 500 to 1,000%. A pound of pepper that cost the farmer perhaps 1 unit of value might sell to the consumer for 5 to 10 units of value. This enormous markup reflected the genuine costs and risks involved in transport, storage, and intermediation, but it also reflected the willingness of wealthy consumers to pay extraordinary prices for access to pepper. The Venetian merchant who purchased pepper in Alexandria faced decisions about timing and quantity. Purchasing large quantities reduced the per-unit cost, but required capital reserves and storage facilities. Purchasing small quantities reduced risk but meant higher per-unit costs. A merchant with capital could purchase pepper when prices were low, store it, and sell it when prices rose. This required understanding market cycles and having the financial resources to hold inventory. The storage of pepper itself involved costs and risks. Pepper could deteriorate if exposed to moisture or excessive heat. Warehouses required maintenance and security against theft. Merchants employed guards and paid rent for storage space. These costs were factored into the final price. A merchant who stored pepper for 6 months before selling it needed to recover not merely the purchase price, but also the storage costs and the opportunity cost of capital tied up in inventory. The demand for pepper in Europe was not uniform across regions or social classes. Wealthy nobles and merchants could afford pepper regularly. Monasteries and churches purchased pepper for religious ceremonies and medicinal purposes. Apothecaries stocked pepper for medical use. Wealthy households served pepper-spiced dishes at feasts. The demand from these sources was relatively stable and price-insensitive. These customers would purchase pepper regardless of price because they could afford it and valued the status it conveyed. The broader population could rarely afford pepper. A peasant or labourer might encounter pepper only occasionally, perhaps at a feast hosted by a lord or in a medicinal preparation prescribed by a physician. For most of the population, pepper was not a commodity they could purchase. This meant that the market for pepper was limited to the wealthy. The limited market size combined with constrained supply created the conditions for high prices. The high prices created incentives for merchants to seek alternatives or substitutes. Ginger, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg could partially substitute for pepper in some applications. These spices were also expensive, but sometimes cheaper than pepper. A merchant might purchase ginger instead of pepper if ginger prices were lower. However, pepper remained the most valued spice, commanding premium prices. Wealthy consumers preferred pepper and would pay more for it. The prices of pepper fluctuated based on supply conditions, political events, and market sentiment. A poor harvest in Kerala could reduce supply and drive prices higher across Europe. A shipwreck could destroy pepper supplies and create temporary shortages. A new ruler in Egypt might impose higher taxes, increasing costs for merchants and raising consumer prices. Conversely, a particularly good harvest or the arrival of multiple ships with pepper supplies could cause prices to fall. These price fluctuations created opportunities for merchants who could predict them accurately. Some merchants attempted to manipulate prices by hoarding pepper. A wealthy merchant or group of merchants could purchase large quantities of pepper, withhold them from the market, and release them when prices rose. This manipulation required substantial capital and storage capacity. It also involved risk. If prices fell unexpectedly or if new supplies arrived, the merchant holding large stocks could suffer losses. Successful price manipulation could generate enormous profits, but unsuccessful attempts could bankrupt merchants. Venice attempted to regulate pepper prices through various mechanisms. The Venetian government sometimes restricted the quantity of pepper that merchants could purchase or sell, attempting to maintain price stability. These regulations protected consumers from extreme price spikes but also limited merchant profits. The regulations reflected a tension between allowing merchants to profit from trade and protecting the broader population from price gouging. This tension would persist throughout the medieval period. The high prices of pepper created wealth for merchants, but also created frustration among those who could not afford pepper. European rulers and merchants increasingly viewed the pepper trade as a source of wealth that should be captured by Europeans, rather than flowing to Islamic intermediaries. This resentment would eventually drive exploration and the search for alternative routes that would bypass Islamic gatekeepers and reduce prices by eliminating intermediaries. The prices of pepper also reflected the genuine difficulty and danger of long-distance trade. Merchants risked their capital and sometimes their lives. Ships sank, caravans were robbed, merchants were killed or enslaved. The prices compensated merchants for these risks. A merchant who survived multiple voyages and accumulated wealth through pepper trade had genuinely earned that wealth through risk-taking and skill. The high prices were not merely extraction, but compensation for genuine economic activity and risk-bearing. Venice and Genoa emerged as the two dominant European powers in Mediterranean trade during the 13th and 14th centuries. Both were maritime republics with powerful navies, merchant networks, and political sophistication. Both sought to control pepper trade and the wealth it generated. Their competition shaped Mediterranean politics, warfare, and commerce for centuries. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa was not merely commercial, but existential. Each city viewed the other as a threat to its survival and prosperity. The competition manifested in multiple forms simultaneously. Merchants from the two cities undercut each other's prices, competed for access to suppliers, and attempted to secure exclusive trading privileges. The governments of the two cities fought naval wars, blockaded each other's ports, and sought to undermine each other's political alliances. The competition was relentless and often brutal. Venice's advantages rested on several foundations. The city controlled strategic positions in the Mediterranean and maintained superior naval power. Venetian merchants had established trading posts throughout the Levant and maintained close relationships with Islamic rulers. The Venetian government provided institutional support for merchants through regulations, dispute resolution, and military protection. Venice accumulated capital reserves that allowed merchants to finance large trading ventures. The city's political stability, compared to many other European regions, made it an attractive base for merchants. Genoa possessed similar advantages, but operated from a different geographic position. Genoa controlled access to the Western Mediterranean and maintained trading posts in North Africa and Spain. Genoese merchants were equally aggressive in pursuing trade opportunities. The Genoese government supported merchants with military force and institutional frameworks. Genoa's rivalry with Venice drove both cities to invest heavily in naval power and merchant networks. The competition between Venice and Genoa occasionally erupted into open warfare. The War of the Sicilian Vespers, 1282–1302, saw Venice and Genoa fighting on opposite sides of a conflict over control of Sicily. Naval battles between Venetian and Genoese fleets resulted in significant casualties and destruction. The Battle of Curzala, 1298, saw a Genoese fleet defeat a Venetian fleet, capturing numerous Venetian merchants and ships. These conflicts disrupted trade, destroyed merchant ships, and diverted resources from commerce to warfare. Beyond direct military conflict, Venice and Genoa competed through political maneuvering. Each city sought alliances with Islamic rulers to secure trading privileges. Venice cultivated relationships with the Mamluk rulers of Egypt, who controlled Alexandria and the Red Sea routes. Genoa pursued relationships with the Ottoman Empire and other Islamic powers. The alliances shifted based on political circumstances. A ruler who favoured Venice one year might favour Genoa the next, depending on diplomatic negotiations and the incentives offered. Venice pursued a strategy of attempting to monopolise pepper supplies. The Venetian government sometimes purchased large quantities of pepper and restricted the quantity that other merchants could trade. This strategy aimed to control prices and prevent competitors from accessing supplies. The monopoly strategy sometimes succeeded in raising prices and generating profits for Venetian merchants. However, it also created incentives for other merchants to seek alternative sources or routes, which eventually undermined the monopoly. Genoa pursued a strategy of competing on price and service. Genoese merchants often offered lower prices than Venetian merchants, attempting to capture market share. Genoese merchants also developed alternative routes and relationships with suppliers, seeking to reduce dependence on the same intermediaries that Venice relied upon. The Genoese strategy was less focused on monopoly and more focused on competitive advantage through efficiency and innovation. The competition between Venice and Genoa drove both cities to invest in infrastructure and institutions that supported trade. Both cities developed sophisticated banking systems that allowed merchants to finance long-distance trade without physically transporting large quantities of gold or silver. Both cities established legal frameworks for resolving merchant disputes and enforcing contracts. Both cities invested in shipbuilding and naval technology. The competition created incentives for innovation and improvement. Other European powers sought to participate in pepper trade, but faced barriers created by Venetian and Genoese dominance. Merchants from other Italian cities, from Spain, from France, and from other regions attempted to engage in pepper trade, but found themselves excluded from key markets or unable to compete with established merchants. The barriers to entry were substantial. Successful pepper merchants required capital, knowledge of distant markets, relationships with suppliers, and protection from pirates and rival merchants. Venetian and Genoese merchants possessed these advantages. Others did not. The competition created incentives for European rulers to seek alternative routes that would bypass Venetian and Genoese control. If a ruler could establish a direct trade route to pepper sources, that ruler could capture the profits that currently flowed to Venetian and Genoese merchants. This incentive would eventually drive exploration and the search for sea routes to India that would bypass the Mediterranean entirely. The competition also created incentives for merchants to seek price controls or regulatory advantages. Venetian merchants lobbied their government to restrict Genoese access to Venetian markets. Genoese merchants sought similar restrictions on Venetian merchants in Genoese territories. These regulatory battles sometimes succeeded in limiting competition, but also created inefficiencies and higher prices for consumers. The regulatory approach to competition was less effective than allowing merchants to compete freely, but medieval governments often preferred regulatory control to free competition. The competition between Venice and Genoa reflected deeper economic principles. Scarcity creates value. Control of scarce resources creates power. Competition for control of scarce resources drives conflict. The pepper trade exemplified these principles. Pepper was scarce. Control of pepper trade created wealth and power. Competition for control drove Venice and Genoa into rivalry that lasted centuries. The competition also revealed the limitations of medieval economic systems. Neither Venice nor Genoa could completely monopolize pepper trade. Islamic merchants remained important intermediaries. Other European merchants found ways to participate in trade, despite barriers. The market could not be completely controlled by any single power. This reality would eventually become apparent to European rulers, driving them to seek new routes and new sources of pepper that would break the existing monopoly. The competition between Venice and Genoa created a dynamic system where neither power could rest on its advantages. Genoa's challenge to Venetian dominance forced Venice to innovate and improve. Venice's superior resources forced Genoa to seek alternative strategies. The competition drove both cities toward greater efficiency and sophistication in trade. The ultimate result was that European merchants became increasingly capable of engaging in long-distance trade, which eventually enabled them to bypass Mediterranean intermediaries entirely. By the 15th century, the situation in Europe had become increasingly dire for those seeking pepper. The Ottoman Empire, having conquered Constantinople in 1453, now controlled the straits and passages through which pepper travelled from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Ottomans imposed heavy taxes on all goods passing through their territories. They restricted Christian merchants' access to traditional trading posts. They threatened to close routes entirely if their demands were not met. The threat was not merely economic, but existential. European access to pepper, which had become essential to the functioning of wealthy households and institutions, now depended on the goodwill of a power that viewed Christian merchants with suspicion and hostility. Pepper prices in Europe climbed dramatically during the 15th century. The combination of Ottoman restrictions, reduced supply, and increased demand created a crisis. A pound of pepper that had cost 1 florin in the 14th century might cost 2 or 3 florins in the 15th century. The price increases rippled through European economies. Wealthy households reduced their consumption of pepper. Institutions that relied on pepper for medicinal purposes faced difficult choices about whether to continue purchasing at inflated prices. Merchants who had built fortunes on pepper trade found their profits squeezed by higher acquisition costs. The price crisis created desperation among European rulers and merchants. They recognized that the existing system, relying on Islamic intermediaries and Ottoman gatekeepers, was becoming untenable. The wealth flowing to Islamic merchants and Ottoman rulers represented resources that European powers believed should remain in Europe. The dependence on foreign powers for access to essential commodities was viewed as intolerable. The situation demanded a solution. Portugal emerged as the first European power to pursue a systematic response to this crisis. Prince Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese royal figure, sponsored expeditions down the African coast, beginning in the early 15th century. The stated goal was to find alternative routes to pepper sources and to establish direct trade with spice-producing regions. The expeditions were motivated by economic desperation, the need to break the Ottoman and Islamic monopoly on pepper trade. They were also motivated by religious fervour, the desire to expand Christian territory and convert non-Christian populations. The Portuguese expeditions were not primarily seeking gold or conquest, though these became secondary objectives. The primary goal was pepper. The Portuguese understood that if they could establish a sea route to India that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely, they could access pepper directly from producers. They could eliminate Islamic intermediaries and Ottoman gatekeepers. They could reduce prices dramatically by eliminating the accumulated markups of multiple intermediaries. The economic incentive was enormous. The Portuguese expeditions proceeded slowly and cautiously. Each voyage ventured further down the African coast, establishing trading posts and gathering information about geography and trade conditions. The voyages were dangerous. Ships were lost to storms. Crews suffered from disease. Some expeditions encountered hostile populations. Progress was measured in increments. Reaching a particular cape or establishing a trading post represented success. The Portuguese persisted despite setbacks because the potential rewards justified the risks and costs. Historians continue to debate the relative importance of economic motivation versus religious motivation in driving Portuguese exploration. The evidence suggests that economic factors were primary. The Portuguese sought pepper and other spices. Religious fervour provided additional motivation and justification, but the fundamental driver was economic desperation. The Ottoman control of traditional routes had created a crisis that demanded a solution. Direct access to pepper sources represented that solution. Other European powers watched Portuguese progress with interest and concern. If Portugal successfully established a direct route to pepper sources, Portuguese merchants would capture enormous profits. Other European powers would be excluded from this lucrative trade. The incentive to compete with Portugal became urgent. Spain, France, and other powers began sponsoring their own expeditions, seeking to establish alternative routes or discover new sources of pepper and other spices. The desperation of European powers created an environment where risky ventures became acceptable. Expeditions that would have seemed impossibly dangerous in earlier periods now attracted support. Merchants and rulers were willing to invest enormous resources in ventures with uncertain outcomes because the potential rewards were so substantial. The desperation also created an environment where innovation flourished. New ship designs, navigation techniques, and trading strategies emerged from the competition to find alternative routes. The Ottoman threat created urgency that drove exploration forward. If the Ottomans completely closed traditional routes, European access to pepper would cease entirely. This prospect was unacceptable to European rulers and merchants. The need to find alternatives before the crisis became complete drove exploration with intensity that might not have emerged from mere commercial opportunity. The desperation was genuine and profound. The desperation also created moral compromises. Portuguese explorers and traders engaged in slave trading, establishing the foundations for the Atlantic slave trade. They used violence to establish trading posts and secure supplies. They treated indigenous populations with brutality. The desperation to access pepper and other spices created an environment where such practices seemed justified, or at least acceptable. The moral costs of breaking the pepper monopoly would eventually become apparent, but they were not the primary concern of those engaged in exploration. The desperation of European powers also created opportunities for merchants and explorers who could offer solutions. A merchant who could establish a trading post in a new location could accumulate enormous wealth. An explorer who could chart a new route could gain fame and fortune. The incentives for innovation and risk-taking were powerful. Talented merchants and explorers were drawn to the challenge of breaking the pepper monopoly. The desperation also created instability in existing trade networks. As European powers pursued alternative routes, they reduced their reliance on traditional intermediaries. Islamic merchants and Ottoman rulers recognized that their control over pepper trade was being threatened. They attempted to maintain their position through various means, restricting access, raising prices, forming alliances. However, the fundamental trend was toward disruption of the existing system. The desperation of the 15th century represented a turning point in world history. The existing system of pepper trade, which had persisted for centuries, was becoming unsustainable. European powers could not accept permanent dependence on Ottoman and Islamic intermediaries. The search for alternatives would eventually succeed, but not before enormous resources had been invested and significant risks taken. The desperation drove exploration that would reshape the world in ways that no one could have predicted. The Portuguese expedition, led by Vasco da Gama, reached the coast of India in 1498, establishing the first direct European sea route to pepper sources. The voyage had taken months, following the African coast around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean. The achievement was extraordinary, a sea route that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely, that avoided Ottoman and Islamic intermediaries, that connected Europe directly to the sources of pepper. Da Gama's expedition represented the culmination of decades of Portuguese exploration and the beginning of a new era in global trade. The implications of da Gama's success were immediately apparent to European rulers and merchants. A sea route to India meant that pepper could be transported directly from producers to European consumers without passing through Islamic intermediaries or Ottoman territories. The accumulated markups that had made pepper so expensive could be eliminated, prices would fall dramatically. The wealth that had flowed to Islamic and Ottoman merchants would now flow to European merchants and rulers. The monopoly that had persisted for centuries was broken. The Portuguese quickly established trading posts along the Indian coast and began purchasing pepper directly from producers and local merchants. The Portuguese prices were lower than prices charged by Islamic intermediaries, which meant that local suppliers had incentives to sell to Portuguese merchants rather than to traditional Islamic traders. The Portuguese used military force to protect their trading posts and merchant ships, establishing a monopoly of their own. Within a few decades, Portuguese merchants controlled a substantial portion of pepper trade flowing to Europe. The success of the Portuguese route inspired other European powers to pursue their own expeditions. Christopher Columbus sailed westward in 1492, seeking an alternative route to spice sources. Columbus believed that sailing west across the Atlantic would reach the spice islands of Southeast Asia more quickly than sailing around Africa. Columbus was wrong about geography. The Atlantic was far wider than he believed, and the Americas lay in between. However, Columbus's voyage led to the European discovery of the Americas, which would eventually reshape global trade and politics. The search for alternative routes continued with intensity. Merchants and rulers understood that whoever could establish the most efficient route to pepper sources would accumulate the greatest wealth. Ferdinand Magellan led an expedition that departed Spain in 1519, seeking to reach the Spice Islands by sailing westward around the world. Magellan's expedition was motivated primarily by spices, not by abstract curiosity about geography. The expedition faced enormous difficulties: storms, starvation, disease, and hostile encounters. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines in 1521. However, the expedition eventually reached the Spice Islands and returned to Spain with a cargo of cloves and other spices. Magellan's expedition proved that circumnavigating the world was possible, though barely. The voyage took 3 years and cost the lives of most crew members. The profits from the spice cargo did not fully compensate for the enormous costs and losses. However, the expedition demonstrated that multiple routes to spice sources existed. The monopoly that Islamic and Ottoman merchants had held was truly broken. European powers now had access to multiple routes and sources. The consequences of breaking the pepper monopoly extended far beyond the spice trade itself. The expeditions that sought pepper also discovered new lands, new peoples, and new resources. The Americas contained vast territories and populations previously unknown to Europeans. The Pacific Ocean was far larger than anyone had anticipated. New trade routes connected distant regions that had previously been isolated. The global trade network that emerged from the search for pepper would eventually encompass the entire world. The discovery of the Americas had consequences that no one could have predicted. The Americas contained resources that were valuable to Europeans: gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, and eventually many other commodities. The colonization of the Americas by European powers would reshape global demographics, economics, and politics. Millions of indigenous people would die from disease and violence. Millions of Africans would be enslaved and transported to the Americas. The global inequalities that characterize the modern world would have their origins in the colonization that began with the search for pepper. The consequences also included the emergence of new forms of political organization. The joint stock company emerged as a mechanism for financing long-distance trade and exploration. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was essentially a military and trading hybrid, more powerful than many nations. It maintained its own navy, established its own trading posts, negotiated its own treaties, and exercised governmental authority over territories it controlled. The joint stock company represented a new form of organization that combined commercial and political power. The consequences included the emergence of new financial instruments and institutions. Insurance emerged as merchants sought to protect themselves against the risks of long-distance trade. Futures markets emerged as merchants sought to hedge against price fluctuations. Banking systems became more sophisticated as merchants required credit to finance trading ventures. Stock markets emerged as investors sought to participate in the profits of trading companies. The modern financial system has its origins in the mechanisms developed to finance and manage pepper trade. The consequences included the emergence of new forms of inequality. The wealth generated by pepper trade and colonial expansion flowed primarily to European merchants and rulers. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia were exploited for their resources and labor. The global inequalities that emerged from this period persist into the modern world. The search for pepper, which began as a practical response to the need for food preservation, eventually created the foundations for global colonialism and the inequalities that characterize the modern world. The consequences also included technological innovation. The need to navigate long ocean voyages drove improvements in ship design, navigation instruments, and cartography. The caravel, a ship design that emerged in Portugal, was more maneuverable and seaworthy than earlier designs. The astrolabe and other navigation instruments allowed sailors to determine their latitude and longitude with greater accuracy. Maps became more accurate as explorers gathered information about geography. The technological innovations that emerged from the search for pepper would have applications far beyond trade. The consequences included the emergence of new diseases and ecological disruptions. The exchange of crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World, the Columbian Exchange, had profound consequences. Crops from the Americas like potatoes and maize eventually transformed agriculture and demographics in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Diseases from the Old World devastated indigenous populations in the Americas. The ecological disruptions created by the introduction of new species into new environments persisted for centuries. The consequences of breaking the pepper monopoly were therefore far more extensive than anyone anticipated. The search for pepper drove exploration that discovered new continents, new peoples, and new resources. The exploration led to colonization, which created new forms of inequality and exploitation. The colonization led to the emergence of new financial systems, new forms of political organization, and new technologies. The consequences reshaped the world in ways that persist into the present day. The breaking of the pepper monopoly did not lead to the emergence of free and competitive markets. Instead, new monopolies formed as European powers competed to control pepper sources and trade routes. The Portuguese established a monopoly in the Indian Ocean, using military force to exclude competitors and extract maximum profit from pepper trade. The Spanish pursued monopoly control in the Pacific and the Americas. The Dutch, entering the competition later, pursued aggressive strategies to displace Portuguese and Spanish dominance. Each European power sought to replicate the monopoly that Islamic and Ottoman merchants had previously held, merely with European merchants and rulers capturing the profits instead. The transformation from merchant competition to imperial conquest occurred gradually but inexorably. Early Portuguese traders in India engaged in commerce with local rulers and merchants, purchasing pepper and other spices through negotiation and trade. Within decades, the Portuguese shifted toward military conquest and territorial control. The Portuguese established fortified trading posts, then expanded these posts into territorial possessions. The Portuguese used military force to prevent local rulers from trading with competitors. The Portuguese extracted tributes and taxes from territories they controlled. Commerce transformed into colonialism. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, represented the culmination of this transformation. The VOC, as it was known in Dutch, was simultaneously a trading company and a military power. It maintained a substantial navy, established fortified trading posts, negotiated treaties with local rulers, and exercised governmental authority over territories it controlled. The VOC did not merely trade in spices, it conquered territories, enslaved populations, and extracted resources through force and coercion. The VOC represented the fusion of commercial enterprise and imperial power. Pepper prices in Europe fell dramatically as new sources became accessible and competition increased. A pound of pepper that had cost 2 or 3 florins in the 15th century might cost 1 florin or less by the 17th century. The price decline reflected the elimination of intermediaries and the increase in supply from multiple sources. However, the price decline did not benefit the populations of pepper-producing regions. Instead, the declining prices reflected the shift from merchant competition to imperial exploitation. Pepper producers and local rulers lost bargaining power as European powers used military force to dictate terms. The transformation from merchant competition to imperial conquest created new forms of wealth extraction. Islamic merchants had accumulated wealth through their control of trade routes and their role as intermediaries. European merchants initially accumulated wealth through similar mechanisms, controlling routes and intermediating trade. However, as European powers established territorial control, they shifted toward extracting wealth through direct control of production. The Portuguese and Dutch forced pepper farmers to sell exclusively to European merchants at prices dictated by Europeans. The farmers lost the ability to negotiate or seek alternative buyers. The transformation also involved the disruption and destruction of existing trade networks. Islamic merchants who had dominated pepper trade for centuries found their markets eliminated as European powers monopolized trade. Arab merchants lost access to pepper sources as European powers conquered territories and excluded competitors. The centuries-old networks of Islamic commerce that had connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean were dismantled. The wealth that had flowed to Islamic merchants and Ottoman rulers was redirected to European merchants and rulers. The transformation created new political structures in pepper-producing regions. Local rulers who had previously maintained independence lost power as European forces conquered territories. Some local rulers collaborated with European powers, trading their authority for a share of profits. Others resisted but were eventually defeated. The result was the emergence of colonial administrations that answered to European powers rather than to local populations. The pepper trade, which had previously been conducted through negotiation and commerce, became an instrument of colonial domination. The transformation also involved the emergence of new labor systems. In earlier periods, pepper was produced by farmers who owned or controlled land and made decisions about production. As European powers established control, they shifted towards systems that maximized production and profit extraction. In some regions, European powers established plantations worked by enslaved labor. In other regions, they imposed systems of forced labor or taxation that compelled farmers to produce pepper for European merchants. The labor systems that emerged from the pepper trade would eventually become models for colonial exploitation throughout the world. The transformation created new forms of economic organization. The joint stock company emerged as the primary mechanism for organizing long-distance trade and colonial enterprise. The company combined capital from multiple investors, allowing large-scale ventures that individual merchants could not finance. The company maintained its own military forces, allowing it to exercise power independent of European governments. The company negotiated treaties, established laws, and exercised authority over territories. The joint stock company represented a new form of organization that blurred the boundaries between commerce and government. The transformation also involved the emergence of new forms of competition. Rather than competing through price or service, European powers competed through military force and territorial conquest. The competition for pepper sources and trade routes drove European powers to invest in naval power, military technology, and territorial expansion. The competition eventually extended beyond pepper to other spices, tropical products, and eventually all resources in colonial territories. The pepper trade initiated a pattern of competition through imperial conquest that would persist for centuries. The transformation created new forms of inequality within Europe as well. Merchants and rulers who controlled pepper trade accumulated enormous wealth. This wealth allowed them to invest in other ventures, to purchase land and titles, to exercise political power. The wealth generated by pepper trade and colonial expansion created new merchant classes that challenged the authority of feudal nobility. The transformation of economic systems from feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism had its origins in the wealth generated by pepper trade and colonial exploitation. The transformation also involved the emergence of new ideologies that justified colonial conquest and exploitation. European powers developed theories of racial superiority, religious duty, and civilizational mission that justified the conquest and exploitation of non-European peoples. These ideologies were not inevitable consequences of pepper trade, but they emerged in the context of competition for control of pepper sources and other colonial resources. The ideologies would persist long after the original economic motivations had changed, shaping global politics and society for centuries. The transformation from merchant competition to imperial conquest represented a fundamental shift in how global trade operated. The medieval pepper trade had been conducted through networks of merchants who negotiated with each other and with local rulers. The early modern pepper trade shifted towards systems where European powers used military force to dictate terms and extract maximum wealth. The transformation created the foundations for the colonial systems that would dominate the world for the next 3 centuries. The pepper trade reshaped the foundations of human economic organization. Medieval commerce, contrary to assumption, derived its power not from agriculture, but from trade in scarce commodities. Pepper exemplified this principle. A single product generated disproportionate wealth and political influence despite representing minimal trade volume by weight. The mechanisms developed to finance pepper commerce became the architecture of modern capitalism. Banks emerged to provide credit for merchants purchasing supplies before sale. Insurance systems protected against maritime losses. Futures markets allowed merchants to hedge price volatility. Stock markets enabled investors to participate in profits without direct participation in trade. These financial innovations, born from pepper's scarcity and value, persist as foundations of contemporary economics. The joint stock company that organized pepper ventures became the prototype for modern corporations. Multiple investors pooled capital to finance ventures exceeding individual capacity. These companies maintained military forces, negotiated treaties, and exercised governmental authority over territories. The modern corporation, though stripped of military and governmental functions, retains the structural innovations of pepper trade companies: separated ownership and management, capital accumulation through share sales, organizational perpetuity independent of individual members. Exploration driven by pepper competition created the global trade network, connecting previously isolated regions. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English merchants established routes that eventually encompassed the world. These connections facilitated not merely commerce but disease transmission, crop transfer, and population movement. The global economy that characterizes modernity emerged directly from networks established to access pepper sources. Colonialism, that followed pepper trade competition, created political structures dominating the modern world. European powers conquered vast territories across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, establishing colonial administrations extracting resources for European benefit. These colonial systems persisted for centuries, shaping territorial boundaries, political institutions, and demographic patterns that persist into decolonization and beyond. Contemporary global inequality traces directly to pepper trade colonialism. Wealth accumulated by European merchants and rulers through pepper commerce and colonial exploitation enabled investment in industrial development, technological advancement, and military capability. Colonized regions, systematically exploited for resources, remained economically dependent and politically subordinate. Modern wealthy nations correspond largely to former colonial powers. Impoverished nations correspond largely to formerly colonized territories. This correlation reflects not accident, but structural consequence of pepper trade competition. The pepper trade shaped international law, diplomacy, and technology. Negotiating treaties with distant rulers, establishing foreign trading posts, and resolving merchant disputes created pressure for legal frameworks and diplomatic protocols. Navigation instruments, cartography, and ship design advanced to enable long voyages. Communication systems developed to transmit market information across distances. These innovations eventually catalyzed the Industrial Revolution and modern technological development. Environmental exploitation patterns originating in pepper production persist globally. Forest clearing for pepper cultivation transformed landscapes, introduced crops and animals, created ecological disruptions persisting into modernity. Resource extraction from colonial territories without sustainability consideration generated environmental damage continuing today. Contemporary environmental crises reflect in part exploitation patterns established during pepper trade colonialism. The pepper trade's legacy extends invisibly through modern systems. Financial architecture, corporate organization, global trade networks, political inequalities, environmental degradation, and cultural exchanges characterizing contemporary civilization all originate in medieval competition for a small black seed. The consequences of that competition, though often unrecognized, continue shaping human civilization fundamentally.